For someone whose entire career has been focused on joy, why a podcast on pain? Because these stories need to be told. A good phoenix rising out of the ashes story reminds us all that not only can we survive, we can thrive. And when we emerge, we're different. That's the alchemy of pain. Welcome to the Alchemy of Pain. I have the great privilege of interviewing people who have been through painful situations they would have never asked for. And yet how they responded, how they coped, how they made it through has changed them forever. And many times in ways that are now serving the world in beautiful ways. I'm almost already filled with emotion to introduce you to someone who I have admired from afar. I saw the name of her new book, The Gifts of Grief, and it went right inside of me. Because though it's taken a while, and you all know my story, I've come to see those losses that have shaped me as gifts to help me serve the world in a more impactful way. You may have seen her. She is a mental health advocate focusing on men's mental health, suicide prevention. She speaks on campuses around the country and perhaps even the world. She has many thousands of followers because she is a light in the darkness. Leslie Weirich, I'm so honored to have you here.
And thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's an honor to be here and to share a bit of our story with your listeners today. And I hope that something in what we discuss will give somebody hope to know that on the other side of maybe their darkest hours, life can be good again.
Life can be good again. What a great jumping off point. But one of the things we talk about is the dark time before the light shone. And I can only imagine that your book, The Gifts of Grief, delves into those dark times. Can you give us a glimpse into the pains that you've experienced?
Sure. Well, I kind of say grief is my middle name, Brenda, because I've been grieving since I was 16 years old, and I'll be 65 in September. So over the last 47 years, I lost a sister that I never knew before she was born, and I dedicate a chapter in my book to every life that I've either known about or lost, and then what that life taught me and what losing that person taught me to prepare me for what was coming next. So that's my book is about losing 3 siblings to cancer, a sister and 2 brothers, also losing 2 infant daughters, my 20-year-old son to suicide, my best friend of 31 years who died in the middle of the night in her sleep from a heart defect. And then my parents lived very long lives. So I was very blessed. I had them for a long time, but they were actually, as I say, the first people in my life that died in the right order, shall we say. So each of those lives, taught me something about myself. And I thought somewhere in my journey, people always talk about wanting to write a book. I tried to avoid writing a book for many years and many decades. And as I became more open with my story on LinkedIn, particularly the suicide of my son, which happened in 2016, which we can talk about, more and more people would reach out to me and say, have you ever thought about writing a book? Have you ever thought about writing a book? And I would tuck those away in a folder in my email and say, someday, maybe. And then last year, I had a good friend that said to me, well, Leslie, I think you should write your book before you turn 65. And I said, ooh, that birthday's coming around the corner. So it was my honor to write a book last year called The Gifts of Grief, How 4 Decades of Loss Shaped My Life. And then really blessed that we were able to release that book on Amazon January 5th, which would have been my son's 28th birthday.
Your son's name?
Austin Robert Weirich. He's a great kid.
Mm-hmm. And today, you have used that pain of that loss. What's the mission when you go and speak?
Well, I always say, and anyone that ever hears me speak, I always say, my goal in life is to make sure that no other parent, no other mom ever has to hear her doorbell ring at 2:30 in the morning. So backing up a little bit, I'll tell you about my son first, because I always like to talk about who he was. I think, unfortunately, suicide is the only kind of death, Brenda, where we focus more on how someone died than how they lived. And even when we had his celebration of life, I said, I'm not here to talk about the last few seconds of his life. I'm here to talk about the 20 years that he was here. So, our son Austin, I look at his picture here. I have a sketch of him in my office. Our son Austin was what the world would call a high achiever, an overachiever. He was the president of his freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior class. He ran track and played football, was voted scholar athlete in one or both of those sports all 4 years of high school. He actually received something called the Hugh O'Brien Leadership Award, which is only given to one student in the entire high school. You have to be nominated by your principal. They send you to a leadership conference. So he received $26,000 in renewable academic scholarships when he graduating above a perfect 4.0. As I say, taking weighted honors. People say, how do you graduate above a perfect 4.0, Leslie? And I said, well, he took college classes his senior year of high school. So if there was an award, if there was anything going on, Brenda, he crushed it. He went after it. And I tell everybody when I really share who he was, when I speak, I say, I don't necessarily share the accolades about my son to boast or brag about him. I want you to understand that that's the face of suicide. And men's mental health shows up very differently than women. And so we have to talk about that and break that down, because many times with men, if my son was having a bad day, he'd stay an hour later and lift weights. He would work it out another way. And so in that true high achieving mode, my son had many college offers, but he chose one of the last two remaining all male colleges in our country. Wabash College, which is west of Indianapolis, very academically rigorous. Almost all of the young men, I'd say over half of them, wind up going to medical school or law school, very high achievers. So it fit his personality really well. He actually, when he landed on that campus, still looking for leadership roles, he was the president of something called the Independent Men's Association. That's a group of young men who choose not to live in a fraternity. About half the student body live in fraternities, half do not. Austin was, just a real independent thinker, independent young guy. So he represented that group well. And then he became involved with something called the War Council. And the War Council stands for Wabash Acts Responsibly. And they deal with issues like alcohol on campus, making good decisions, helping students when college life overwhelms them. And our son Austin was scheduled to lead a meeting for the War Council on the morning of Monday, September the 12th of 2016. And unfortunately, our son never showed up for that meeting. And I say he never showed up because in the early morning hours of Saturday, September 10th, which for your listeners, that happens to be World Suicide Prevention and Awareness Day, our doorbell rang at 2:30 in the morning and changed our lives forever.
So, with that amazing resume of accomplishments and the outstanding human being he was, there were no signals or signs, no warning lights?
That's a great question. And I want to complete our story and I want to answer that question. As I speak all over the nation now, that's a very common question that I get. And when I tell people, when I answer it, they even look more puzzled at me. I say, people said, Leslie, did you see warning signs? And I said, we can talk about the last day of his life. I FaceTimed him for 45 minutes. He was on top of the world. He lifted weights at 4 o'clock that afternoon, talked to his dad at 6 o'clock that evening about all the sports games that weekend. I tell everyone once again, and I was invited to do a TEDx talk and it got canceled during COVID and I need to kind of circle the wagon and get back in there. But my TEDx talk was going to be, the topic was how perfectionism killed my son. And so one of the things that I say, Brenda, is, and when I speak to parents, and I've spoke to gifted and talented parents groups and all kinds of things, is high achievers equal high risk. Because we always said if Austin, anything happened to him when he was growing up, we never had to punish him, Brenda. He punished himself enough. So to answer your question, people ask me, Leslie, did you see warning signs? And I said, I saw no warning signs. He was on top of the world that day. And when I look back at his life, I saw lots of warning signs. Now that I know what I know and I understand mental health, but let me complete our story for you and tell you how rare it was. So by sheer coincidence, Austin took his life on World Suicide Prevention and Awareness Day in 2016. Once again, attending one of the last two remaining all-male colleges in our country. The other one's in Virginia, and I will be going down there the end of March to speak to their student body. It's Hampden-Sydney in Richmond, Virginia. So when you choose to go to an all-male college, it's a whole different kind of thing, and it's highly competitive. Austin played football. He was a defensive end on the football team. And on the 2-year anniversary of Austin's death, September 10th of 2018, we'd receive a text message from one of his former roommates, and they said, Mr. and Mrs. Weirich, I don't know if you heard, but Evan Hansen, the co-captain of the Wabash football team, took his life today. And I'm sorry to have to tell you that, but I didn't want you and your husband to hear about it on the news. Now, Evan Hansen was 21 years old. He had just stood on the football field that Saturday, 2 days earlier, with his parents on both of his sides, celebrating after the game, going out to dinner, got up on Sunday morning, went to football practice, talked to all his teammates, had a meeting with the coaches after the game. And on Monday morning, Evan went missing, and his dad, Chuck Hansen, would find his body a few hours later in the woods. So both young men, both knew each other, both attended one of the same small all-male colleges left in the country, both died by suicide by sheer coincidence on World Suicide Prevention and Awareness Day, just 2 years apart. So the following week after Evan's death, and I can tell you more about both of our sons' backgrounds, the following week after Evan's death, we would be contacted by the largest newspaper in our state, which was the Indianapolis Star. They wanted to know if we would share our part of the story with Chuck and Mary Hansen, Evan's parents. They thought if we both talked about our stories and shared them, that something in there might help another family. We agreed. That article came out 2 weeks after Evan's death on a Wednesday, and by Saturday, we'd made national news as a human interest sports story. So you can Google, 2 Wabash football players die by suicide. And as I tell everybody, our story is so rare, I couldn't make it up if I tried, nor would I ever want to. But what we have both done with our story and our different backgrounds, we have become very good friends with Chuck and Mary Hansen that live in Indianapolis. They have an amazing foundation, the Evan R. Hansen Legacy Foundation. They do a lot with concussion research. Evan had been playing tackle football since he was 7 years old. And I know this might not be popular with some of your listeners, but I am not a fan or an advocate of young boys playing tackle football. And so Evan's parents were so brave to donate that brain tissue within a few hours of his death, and it came back confirmed stage 1 CTE, chronic traumatic encephaly. So Evan had been a biology major, and he had done the research on his laptop, and he knew he had it. He had memory loss. He had certain things happen. And both of our sons were in counseling. Both of our sons, we were working on things with their, just growing up, the stress of their lives. But Evan's parents, 100%, his death was a result of, injuries and multiple concussions to the brain. And we knew Austin had a few of those too in high school, maybe one in college. But going back to Austin's situation, so Austin, we see the downward decline of his really hard downward decline of his mental health happened his freshman year of college. He had 3 back-to-back football injuries in an 8-week period of time. And the third one, Brenda, took him by ambulance off the field during practice. And he was never the same. He could never really get back in the game his sophomore year. He could never really play the same way. And so his identity, since he was in the 5th grade, was as a football player. I mean, this kid would walk out on the field on bloody knees and bloody elbows to play. He loved the game of football. And when he couldn't play football anymore, who was he, And so one of the things that I work with a lot, particularly when I speak with young men and their military bases, is the correlation between, and I would say suicide is a perfect storm. It's never about one thing. It's about things brewing and leading to that moment. But I'll give you an example. Last year, the Army had their worst year ever for soldier suicide. The leading cause of death in our military today is suicide by personal firearm. And the catalyst that flips the switch on the majority of those suicides with young men is the breakup of personal relationships. So our son drifted into a very unhealthy relationship late in his sophomore year, and ended up taking his life that evening over an argument with a young woman he knew less than 6 months. So we talk a lot about the impulsivity of the young brain. When I talk a lot about, I tell everybody, if you can understand suicide, especially with young people, as the brain is not fully developed, the prefrontal cortex, which is houses our, reasoning, logic, decision making, and impulse control is up there. So these young people, and I call Evan and Austin, even though their circumstances were different, I say they had an amygdala hijack. The back of their brain overwhelmed the front of their brain. And I tell everyone, when you see my son, he was a big boy, Mary. I mean, Brenda, he was 6'4", 240 pounds, Brenda. So he looks like this big grown man, but he was 20. He had 5 more years for the most important part of his brain that he needed that evening. When push came to shove in the heat of an argument with this young woman, he needed impulse control. He needed anger management. He needed reasoning. Those were not fully developed. So I do a very deep dive talk, and it's been very effective over the last few years on military bases. The first base I ever spoke on was at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas. I was invited down there because they'd had 20 suicides on that base that year. 19 of the 20 of those soldiers took their lives over the breakup of a personal relationship. So I'm one of the, I guess, pioneers of discussing the correlation between soldier suicide, sailor suicide with the breakup of a personal relationship. And then you have access to a firearm. So that makes it even, more, accessible.
Already, you have served this audience in such powerful ways by just sharing and connecting those dots. But for you as a human being, you speak so powerfully and you have the facts and you have made purpose out of this pain. When you suffered the loss of your son, I know that you were shell shocked. How
Mhm.
did you claw your own way out of that hole?
Mhm. Great question. So I've met so many incredible people since doing this work. And a lot of them have had tragedy as the work that you've done. When you go into this and you really are open with your story, it draws people to you that want to share their story, right? And so one of the greatest gifts that I've been given is some of the people I have met. And I mean, I call them friends. I have been to their home. I know their story. We have connected. So I met a woman probably a couple years after Austin died. And I do a daily mental health post, a daily story. I write daily on LinkedIn. And I'm not a big social media person, but I love LinkedIn. It's been a powerful platform for me to talk about my work. This woman had had a different kind of tragedy. She actually had lost she would make an excellent guest for you. She'd actually lost her husband at the age of 39 to a rare form of cancer. And then 2 years later, her 6-year-old son would get admitted to the hospital for croup, given the wrong medication, and die. So she started this amazing work in this amazing global foundation called MedSend. She wrote a book called The List, and she sent it to me. And she said, "Hey, Leslie, I've been following you on LinkedIn, and I want to share something with you." She said, "When you go through the kind of tragedy that we have, and you only really get 2 choices in life, just two." She said, "You either can stay stuck in your story or you can stand on your story." Now, we knew within 24 hours of Austin's death that we were not going to be silent. We knew if there was any part of our story that would help somebody, that we were going to use it. Now, we were in shock. We had no idea what it was going to look like. And once again, I did have a 17-year-old daughter at the time when Austin took his life, and I was trying to get her back to some sense of quote unquote normalcy, get her through high school. But I knew as soon as she went off to college, I was really going to get out there and try to help other families and share a story. But I didn't know what that would look like. And I was working full time. I was an executive recruiter. I had a wonderful job, but I just slowly started sharing our story. And when it made national news in that article, I was invited to actually be a keynote speaker for the largest nonprofit in our state. And when they contacted me, I honestly, Brenda, I kind of laughed. And I said, listen, I'm not a speaker. I'm like a mom who's lost her son. And they're like, yeah, we know, we read the story, but we want you to just come and share your story at our event. So finally, my husband said to me, you know, Leslie, you've been wanting to get out and share our story. I think this is your chance. So the first keynote talk I ever gave, which was 5 years ago in January, I took the stage that evening for an event called Jazzin' Up January. There were 750 people there, the middle of a blizzard in the winter, northern Indiana, you know, all the elements were going against us. And if you know anything about a kind of the element or the science behind fundraising, so they put you on at the end of the evening, the powerful story and the ask, right, to raise money. So I took the stage for 24 minutes that evening, and they broke a 5-year fundraising record and raised $249,000 to put licensed clinical therapists in our local schools. So I said, okay, God, I'm a woman of faith. I'm like, you got me, but you're going to have to open up those doors because I have no idea what I'm doing. So I continued to work full time, get out of my lunch hour, go into schools, do events and things, but just kind of, you know, here, there, and everywhere. But finally, note the date, February 25th of 2020. I take a PTO day and I go into a charter high school. It's in South Bend, Indiana, close to Notre Dame. Never have I ever done this before. I'm standing behind the podium. I'm in their auditorium. They're bringing in 2 health education classes at a time. So there's approximately 60 kids in each section, and I'm speaking 3 times that day. We go over the brain. I do a deep dive on my story. They need to know what suicide looks like and how it impacts a family. I somehow or other decided to ask the question, would you raise your hand if you've lost a friend, a family member, anyone you know or love to suicide? I thought maybe half a dozen hands might go up, 6, 12. Over 30 hands went up in the first class. I told my husband I was behind the podium and I kind of gasped and grabbed the podium. I was like, are you kidding me? So I said, okay, I got to do it again. In every class, I had the same response, Brenda. So I drove home that day in tears. Now remember the date, February 25th of 2020. I said to my husband, you know, but this time I'm 60, 61 years old. I said to my husband, I'm like, if not now, when? I'm like, I've got to get out. These kids are hurting. So I told him the story. We were at a point in our lives, in our careers. I said, this is not about making money. I don't know if I'll ever make a dime. It doesn't matter. I need to help these kids. So took a leap of faith. My husband and I said, okay, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to resign from a very good job. I mean, I had, you know, all the things, the 401k, the 6-figure income, you know, I loved my work. I loved, you know, what I did. And so we made the decision that I was going to resign and I was going to try to start speaking full time and make myself more available. 3 weeks later, COVID shuts the world down, right? Clamps the world down. And I was like, okay, somehow or other, and I don't know how to say this, but COVID did the marketing for my work because these kids were hurting more than ever. And so, you know, the world shut down. What are we going to do? So I get this call from the CEO of a community mental health center. They serve 25,000 families, 25,000 clients in 2 counties. You know anything about community mental health? It's tough. And they said, hey, Leslie, we heard you speak at somewhere in the community. Want to know if you'll come over and have a conversation with us about, you know, joining us. Now I'm self-taught. What happened when Austin died was I started taking lots of classes, applied skills in suicide training, safe talk, all kinds of mental health. So I'm really a self-taught, you know, mental health, you know, I have lived experience, right? So I thought, why not? I mean, the world shut down. What am I going to do? So I mask up. We're full blown COVID. I'm sitting in this boardroom with the CEO of this huge community mental health center. And they're like, we want to start a targeted program for suicide prevention. And I was like, well, that's a pretty good idea. Since, you know, I told them what's going on, you know, in our state alone, we were losing someone every 8 hours to suicide. My tiny little state of Indiana. I know you're in California. I don't know what your rates are there, but I'm sure they're not good. And so I always tell everybody that's 90 people a month dying from a preventable form of death. So if you think about this way, Brenda, if we had a rare form of cancer, say we had a rare form of breast cancer, taking that many lives in our state, Do you think we would earmark something in our state legislature and our budget to figure out why? So here's the deal. So I told them, I said, we've got to get in schools. At the time, I was living in the RV capital of the world. And you know what happened during COVID? Everybody's buying trailers and campers and trying to get, so those RV manufacturers, they were booming during COVID. So I went in with the executive director of the foundation. We met with the owners and, the HR directors, and we said, it's very important that you care about the mental health of your employees' kids, because when they die by suicide, that's going to affect your employee at work, right? So we raised about $100,000 in the first 6 to 8 months, and I did my research. We implemented a program called Sources of Strength, which teaches young people. That's a whole nother program, but it's a phenomenal program that teaches young people resiliency through 8 protective factors. You'll always hear about risk factors with suicide. And as I tell everybody, I can talk about those all day long, but I'm sort of sick of talking about risk factors and our rates are going up. I want to flip the script and talk about protective factors. So Sources of Strength, I said, is an evidence-based upstream approach to suicide prevention that rarely mentions the word suicide. Because when you teach kids these protective factors, which we all have in our lives at any age, teens, adults, middle-aged people, whatever, when you teach them how to turn to their strengths instead of vaping, instead of alcohol, instead of drugs, you reduce school violence, you reduce bullying, and it's a peer-led model. So once it's fully implemented, the students run it. So proud and honored to say the first school to fully implement Sources of Strength in our county was Austin's high school, Goshen High School in Goshen, Indiana. So I worked with them for about 2.5 years, and in the course of working for them, became busier and busier. And then we moved out of that area, so I no longer live in that area, but I was really, really honored to be able to work with them for a couple years, kind of during the thick of COVID, and keep some mental health programming going in schools.
I mean, you said you were not a speaker, and yet listen to you. Did you surprise yourself?
Yes and no. I have 35 years of sales and marketing, and I always tell everybody I've sold everything from service to product to people. I said people, I was a recruiter, right? And so I feel like, all of my all of my business background and my professional life led me to this point where I could take those strengths and those gifts and that I've been given, and I could use them. I can use them to raise money for mental health. I can use them to speak in schools. I can use them to speak on military bases. It's interesting you say that because I'd invited the COO of where I happened to be a recruiter that evening to come in here my first keynote. And he knew that it wasn't going to be long before I was resigning. And so I had been using LinkedIn for a while as a recruiter, but I never shared my personal story of losing my son. So I gave them my resignation letter. And then after they received it, I posted my resignation letter on LinkedIn about why I was going to be changing my career. And it's interesting when you share your story. I always say it opens the door for someone to share their story. And, especially when there's been loss and tragedy, that is so powerful. And that's where the real healing can begin because people realize I'm not alone. I'm not alone. And your voice lets other people find their voice. And that's what I love about actually. I mean, your podcast is amazing. I've listened to so many episodes. You've given people voice to tell their story.
Leslie, as you were speaking, I felt my heart swelling because, as you said when you started your speaking career, I don't know if this is ever going to make any money,
Yeah.
but I got to do it. There was this irresistible must, and the audience knows my stories of loss and wondering if I was ever going to feel like Brenda again, and this desire for people to not feel alone, for them to hear other stories of people who have been through. Gosh, when I hear other people's stories, it's like, I got no complaints. But yet we can't minimize anyone's story
Right,
because it is theirs and each pain
right,
is particular. It is
right,
our cross, quote unquote, to
right.
bear and how we respond to it. Well, it's either the story that gets you stuck or it's the story you stand on. I think that is such a powerful thing. Leslie, what is a story you could tell us of having shared on a stage and an impact on a person's life?
Mm. I have a lot of them now because I've been doing this for a while, but I'm going to share a soldier story because, and let me back up and tell you a little bit about how I even started with the military and how that. So as I'm speaking in these schools and COVID shutting the world down, I just kept praying to get in front of young people and save young people and really young men because that's our story, right? With our son. And young men's mental health looks very different. Young men's depression looks different. Young men's depression looks like road rage. Young men's depression looks like alcoholism. Young men's depression looks like anger. It doesn't show up like women's depression, right? So as I'm really, really praying about, okay, God, you gotta open these doors for me because the world was kind of shut down with COVID and we were doing what we could. And so and it came out back in the year 2000. There was something called the prayer of Jabez about expand my territory, expand my territory. So kept telling everybody, I was like speaking it out loud. I'm like, I need to get on a bigger stage. I need to reach more people. I need to reach more than a couple hundred high school students. I need to reach a couple thousand men, a couple thousand young men and women. So in August of 21, I get a message on my LinkedIn DM. Hey, Leslie, I've been following your work. Now you have to remember my son's college was small, under 1,000 students, all male. Hey, Leslie, I've been following your work. I want to let you know I graduated from Wabash College 20 years ago. I'm a lieutenant colonel at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, and I just lost my third soldier in my battalion. Would you please come down here and talk to our chaplain and talk to our soldiers? Well, first of all, he had me I graduated Wabash College. I'm like, okay, you got me. So I call back the next day, and the chaplain's just very Southern. And he said, both my parents are from the South, my grandparents. So, got my heartstrings there. He said, Ms. Leslie, we've lost not 20 soldiers this year, and 19 of the 20 were over broken relationships. He said, I need you to get on down here because they need to hear the story of a mom. Well, so the week before Christmas in 21, I flew down to El Paso, Texas. The holidays can be very triggering. They're very hard for a lot of people. And I still, even when I look back now, sometimes I wonder how I do this, but I gave 7 90-minute presentations in 4 days. My voice held out. But for some reason, I'll just say I found favor with a 3-star general. Okay. And General Sean Bernabe, I'll give him his props here because he has kept me very busy in the last 2.5 years. So General Sean Bernabe really liked my story. He liked the way I wove it together, talked about the brain. I give the 8 warning signs of a toxic relationship. It's a tough talk, Brenda, because what I say is if you reckon, and then they've already heard about my high achieving son. So what I say to them is Austin missed 8 out of 8 of these warning signs. We saw them, his roommates saw them. Everyone knew he was not in a healthy relationship. So if you see even one of these warning signs, now remember, I'm talking to soldiers who have access to firearms. I need you to immediately leave my talk and go lock up your firearms. Give them to a battle buddy after my talk is over. They said my talks are very, very effective because I give them a task list. I'm a mom. They listen to me. And I always tell them, now that I've been doing this long enough, I say the power of what I do is not when I speak, but when I stop speaking. Because the soldiers line up and they want to tell me their stories and they need to tell them in a safe space. So a couple of my success stories. So one of them, so the morning after I gave my first 2 talks on that base, the chaplain picked me up to take me back over to the theater to speak. And he said, Ms. Leslie, you made our chaplaincy office real busy yesterday. And I said, well, I guess that's what I'm here for, right? Apparently they had a married soldier and he came in that afternoon and he said, I know I need help. And they said, why? And he said, because I didn't have my firearm, but if I would have had it, I know I would have shot my wife today and shot myself. So I need help. So the chaplain said, okay, Ms. Leslie, there's 2 lives. Keep on talking today. Keep on talking. So that's one story. I have a lot of stories. So this past May, once again, General Sean Bernabe, they did a suicide prevention summit. They brought in researchers, Dr. Craig Bryan, who wrote the book Rethinking Suicide, lots of experts. They were going to do a day-long summit. They were going to live stream it to 5 Army bases: Fort Carson, Fort Still, Fort Riley, Fort Bliss, and Fort Cavazos, Fort Hood. And they said, but we are not going to do the summit, General Bernabe said, unless you kick it off with your personal story. So once again, General Bernabe's calling me back down to Texas, and he's given my name to lots of other bases. So I go down there and I said to them, well, you've had your worst year ever for suicide. While I appreciate you inviting me to kick off the summit, I don't want to fly to Texas unless I also see the soldiers while I'm there. So they scheduled 5 soldier talks, and I'm so grateful I asked for that. The last talk of the last day, I don't know who's going to listen to this, but I'm going to share all of it because there's a reason. The last talk of the last day, I do a shout out for my home state with the soldiers because there's thousands of them. I'm like, any soldier from Indiana out there, 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday. One soldier from Indiana. His name was Austin. Same as my son. So when the soldiers line up to talk to me, sometimes they'll wait 45 minutes to an hour, depending on where they have to be afterwards. I sit with them, I unplug, I just listen to their story. I assess how high risk they are. And if there's something called MFLAC, Military Family Life Counselors, the military has, as well as the chaplain. So I make sure that I always have there in all my talks in the back of the theater, because my talks are very triggering. And but the soldiers need to talk. So this soldier had waited till everybody cleared out. He came down. I will tell you, Brenda, he was weeping, weeping. He said he had broke up with his girlfriend on the way to my talk. He said that when I put up the slide with the 8 warning signs, he recognized every one of them in his relationship. And he said he stayed in it because she was pregnant, expecting a child. And but he knew it wasn't healthy. But he had seriously thought about putting together a plan over the weekend. He was getting deployed on Monday to end his life. So we talked for a while, and I shared with him, I said, listen, you have a child coming into the world, so you need to be healthy. But I think it's a really brave decision to say you can be healthy and you can be a healthy father, but you don't necessarily want to be in an unhealthy relationship because this child's going to need you. So let's talk about what that's going to look like. And we listened and we talked, and I took him to an MFLAC counselor. I check in every now and then. He's still here and he's got a little girl. So yeah, so I love that story, because had I not requested to speak to those soldiers, I would have missed that talk and I would have missed that soldier. And he was the last talk of the week. So I really felt like, I always say, I don't know if you know the starfish story where you go for the one. I said, I go for the one, and he was my one. So.
And I can't help but recognize that there was a divine force involved. I mean, his name was Austin. He was the last, you insisted on talking to the soldiers. There was something greater at work there. And your work, you just had to be willing. Now, here I am. That
Send
one
me.
little prayer, I need a bigger audience. And because you were walking in the flow of your divine purpose, boom, it opened up, and people are hearing you more and more and more. And I'm so honored that they're hearing you on this platform. And I gotta say, I don't want to give away your talk, but I want to know what the 8 signs of a toxic relationship.
Yeah,
Do
I
you
can
want to
send
share
those to you. I can send those to you, and you can also just look them up. But, a lot of it has to do with jealousy, control. One is walking around on eggshells. You can't live that way the rest of your life. One is checking their social media, checking where their car is, so a lot of them are control issues, and they're very common in young relationships, and older relationships too. I mean, but you know, we, somehow or other, and once again, I'm not totally blaming this young woman for my son's suicide. My son was struggling with things before that. She definitely was the catalyst that evening. But if you think about it and you look into the statistics of this, young women don't take their lives over breakups the way young men do. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the difference? Well, I do a big talk called the Invisible Backpack. And I'll say, when young men come in, I'll be like, every one of you walking in here this morning is dealing with something. And this is another really cool story I have. So last spring, almost a year ago last March, I was invited to do a men's leadership breakfast for my son's college, but the alumni group. Okay. So these men have been out of college for years. The man of the year that morning at the breakfast was an orthopedic surgeon. I mean, they've crushed it in this world, very successful, high achievers, right? So I said to all of them, and I was speaking with a state senator who had authored a piece of mental health legislation. And then I was speaking with a psychiatrist who had works with athletes. And we each had, so they called me, they asked me to come down and speak. Indianapolis is a couple hours away. They're like, Leslie, you have 9 minutes. I said, listen, I'm driving 2 hours. I'll take 10. I'm like, here's the deal. So I get up and one of the sweet young attorneys whispers to me, goes, take 15, Leslie. I said, okay, you got it. So, and I'm a woman of faith. I do give God a lot of the glory for all the work that I do. But I was only one of the 3 speakers that got a standing ovation that morning, because I tell a personal story. It's a personal story. But what I do is with those men, I said, listen, you are all high achievers in your careers. But every one of you walking in here this morning, you're all dealing with something. You've all got that invisible backpack on, and you don't want anybody to know. None of your clients, no one in your firm, no one can know what's in there, right? Well, here's what I'm going to tell you, because they tout their brotherhood because they're an all-male college, right? I said, you're always talking about the strength of your Wabash brotherhood. Why don't you trust it? I said, this morning I'm doing a throwdown challenge. Before you leave this building, this big breakfast, there's about 350 men there. Before you leave this breakfast, you need to get with a Wabash brother, one of your alums, and you need to take one thing out of that invisible backpack and share it with him, and he's going to share it with you. Don't leave here until you do that. And I want you to see how you feel. So once again, the room clears out. Lots of people always want to come up and talk to me afterwards. And, there's the big crowd. And these 2 men are in the back. In fact, one's an NFL referee. And they've been in each other's lives for years. They've known each other socially through school, known each other. So they come up and they're like, we just want to thank you for giving us the throwdown challenge because we took you up on it. He said, the NFL referee, he said, I looked at him and told him that I had never told anybody this before at college, but when I was 10 years old, my dad took his life. It gets better, Brenda. His buddy that he had gone to college with, knew for years, said, I wish I would have known that a long time ago, because then I could have told you that when I was 7 years old, my dad took his life. Both of them knew each other. Both of them never told each other that story until that morning. And I said to them, if I could give an award for lightening the backpack this morning, it would go to the 2 of you. This is the power of this story when we tell it. And one of the things Brene Brown says is shame dies when stories are told in safe places. So we let shame hold us back. We let all that shame mute us and keep us from sharing our stories. And that's what we decided when Austin died is I'm not going to let the shame and stigma of my son's suicide keep me from helping other people. So there you go. And that's what you're doing with this podcast. It's exactly what you're doing with this podcast.
I was just about to say the word shame. So many times we hide in secret the very things that cause us to be able to relate to people and connect in this world. And
Yes.
interestingly, breaking a relationship is often a leading cause of why people end their lives. Sharing our stories is how we connect with each other. And I know I crave connection, Leslie.
Me too.
After all the losses in my life, being able to share my story and realize connection, it means everything. It's the greatest gift. What would you say is the greatest gift of grief?
Ooh, my book is The Gifts of Grief because there are so many, and I share with everyone. So I'm having a book launch a week from Friday at a large community grief center. My goal with this book is really to get out when I speak on military bases to look within a 50 to 75-mile radius, speak at a grief center when I'm finished on the base, and then leave 6 of my signed copies for their grief library. But one of the things that I tell everybody is, so um, 2 of the chapters are over 2 brothers. I lost 2 brothers to cancer. Exactly. There's something about dates in my life, but I lost 2 brothers to cancer on the exact same day, 40 years apart. So one died at 34, and then my next oldest brother died at 69 during COVID with leukemia. And so one got to see his family. My brother died at 34, left behind a wife and 2 young daughters. And then the one who was 69 obviously got to see his children grow up and his grandchildren. But I always tell everybody the gifts of my grief, I have 3 very special nieces, and they belong to those 2 brothers. And because I never grew up with a sister that I knew, these nieces are kind of like I was an aunt when I was 11 years old. So they have become my little sisters more than my. So they are flying in from 3 states to come to my book launch because there's 2 chapters on their dads, along with my brother's namesake, which would have been his granddaughter that he never lived long enough to know because he died at 34. So they are my living, breathing gifts of grief. But there are many gifts of grief, but I think to try to answer your question, the gifts, the one of the greatest gifts of grief, and I say this in my book, grief is our hardest teacher, but it also can teach us things that we can't learn any other way. We can't learn them through job promotions. We can't learn them through success. We can't learn them through living relationships. Grief will teach us something about ourselves and also about other people, but about ourselves that we can only learn when we're going through grief and we come out on the other side. And I tell everybody, I use this analogy with grief. I say, if you take a ball and you're swimming in a pool or the ocean or whatever, and you can hold your hands on it and keep it underwater, Brenda, right? You can feel it trying to pop up, but you got your hands on it, right? The second you let your hands off that ball, what's going to happen? It's going to pop way up in the air, right? But then what's going to happen to it? It's going to float on the water. And it's there. And then you learn how to swim around it. And I tell everybody that's grief because grief never goes away, but life builds up around it, and I have a beautiful, beautiful video of that I'm going to show next week when I speak at the Grief Center. But so I tell everybody, I'm like, the greatest gift of grief is learning that you will get through the other side with time. And I don't give anyone a timetable, but grief is not linear. It's not like you take through, I had a conversation with a father last week, and his story mirrored ours about the loss of his son. I've never talked to anyone whose story was so similar to ours. The breakup of a personal relationship, all of that. His son was a very high achiever. I literally kept it together on that call for an hour and a half and hung up and wept for him and for me. I started grieving all over again 7 years later because I love this. I quote Brene a lot, but she says, grief needs to be held to be healed. And when we run away from it, when we try to use all our energy to push that ball under that water, eventually we're going to have to let our hands off and it's still going to be here. So grief is right there. So grief's like, okay, I'm here, but you're still here too. So what are we going to do together? What can we do together? So I say there's a lot of power in grief that can be your fuel and move you forward when you stop fighting it. When you stop fighting it.
All right, you don't know this, but I have written on my calendar here, so I see it every day. Brenda, stop fighting, start floating.
Oh, I love that.
Because as I was fighting to be normal again, I wasn't allowing grief to have its way with me.
Oh boy, that's what I say in
And
my
it
book.
needed to. It
Yes.
needed to. And I find that when I stop floating, my Mark, he was a very wise man. Miss him every day. And he said, Brenda, if you stop fighting, if you feel like you're drowning, if you stop fighting, your natural buoyancy will cause you to float to the top of the surface and you can breathe again. And I've
Oh,
had to go back to that over and over again since losing him. And I can't thank you enough for the words you've shared, the the amazing power of your life, the amazing power of Austin's life. I honor all of it today, and I thank you for the generosity of your time. Leslie, you are a human I'm so honored to be connected with. Do you have any final words for our audience as we close out?
well, thank you, Brenda. It's just been just a real blessing and to spend this time with you and share a story. Um, I guess I would just tell everyone to really be gentle with yourself through grief. Sometimes you need to take a nap, take a nap. Sometimes, you just need to shut off the phone, shut off the phone. Don't worry about what everyone else is, how they're going to respond to your grief. I don't know how to say this. That's their problem, not yours. The people that love you are going to be there on the other side, and I tell everybody grief takes as long as it takes. And my grief therapist said something to me, really, a couple things she said to me. I have a wonderful grief therapist, and she said, Leslie, grief has kind of been like your sibling. You started it so young in life, with losing your brother. And then she said, our siblings shape us, our experiences as we grow up. So grief has really shaped you. It's been like another sibling to you. But she said, one of the things that, I learned how to do really, really early in life. I say I became an old soul at 21 years old when I was holding my brother's hand. He took his last breath when he was 34, my beloved big brother. But grief taught me that, we as long as we are breathing, we're here for a purpose and we're here for a reason. And I think if I can say anything to anyone in their grief, the thing that healed my heart the most was service. So when I could go out and give back to somebody else, it gave me more healing in my grief than I ever could give to them. So when I sit with these soldiers all over the United States now, and I hear their stories, and I give them a hug, and I'm with them, it's people say, is that so hard to go on military bases? I said, it fills my bucket. It fills my heart. So if I could say anything to anyone, I think Viola Davis said, they say to serve is I can't even remember what the quote is. I just used it this morning, but to serve is to heal. And when we serve others, we think that we're serving them, but it's actually in that service that we get healed. And so that would be my most important message to anybody today is even if you're having the worst day ever, please get out of your house and go see someone, go do something for someone else, and it'll help to heal your heart.
What a beautiful way to end. Please, everyone, The Gifts of Grief is Leslie Weirich's book. Leslie's Hope is your nonprofit organization. Follow her on LinkedIn. She is always providing inspirational content. I could have talked to you forever, and you're stuck with me forever now.
I
I
love that.
am so grateful to be connected with you, and thank you for tuning in to this edition of The Alchemy of Pain as I end every podcast. If you're going through a dark time, like the caterpillar in that chrysalis, and you wonder, am I ever going to get out of here? Keep pressing. You are creating strength in your wings. You will get out of there, and you will have strength in your wings so you can fly. And we will be rooting for you. Have a good day, everybody.